Good evening, everyone. You are watching Direct Line with Mark Unkfer and Don Irvine. Our special guest is Washington Titan of the conservative movement, Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute. Take it away, guys.
Well, thank you, Dwight, and welcome to both Morton Black to Don Irvine as well. Dwight is absolutely right. You're one of the heroes of the movement, and we'll talk a little bit about how you started the Leadership Institute, which I guess was like about 40 years ago.
41 years ago, yeah.
But you started very early, and could you tell us a little bit about your very first Republican National Convention?
Well, I got involved in politics in a serious way by a column by Raymond Moley in Newsweek magazine in October of 1958. And in this piece, and I had been reading Newsweek. In those days, that was before Don's father's favorite newspaper bought the Newsweek magazine. But, and I had come to appreciate Raymond Moley, who had an interesting history. But he said in this column that, in his opinion, the most important and interesting congressional race in 1958, which was an off-year non-presidential election, was the efforts of the labor union bosses to defeat a freshman Republican senator from Arizona named Barry Goldwater, who was running for re-election. And I'd never paid any particular attention to Goldwater before, but I started following Goldwater. And at the 1960 convention, a lot of states elected delegates committed to Goldwater, including my home state of Louisiana. And that was the year that Nixon won, but he didn't win the nomination by a big margin. There were lots of Eastern Establishment people who got delegates, and Goldwater got a number of delegates from a number of states, and it was pretty close. In fact, since I was present at that convention, no, I wasn't present in 60, but at the end of the first ballot, they allowed states to change their votes, and Goldwater was allowed to speak. And he said, gave a rather famous speech in which he said, "Conservatives, grow up, our time will come, we should get behind Nixon for president, and our time will come within the Republican Party." And state after state, every state, with the delegates that supported people other than Nixon, changed their votes until it got down to just the state of Louisiana, which had 20 delegates, and the majority were for Goldwater. I was from Louisiana at the time, and I didn't have any acquaintance with the tiny Republican Party that was down there, except one family that my parents knew. And 10 of the Louisiana delegates to the 1960 Republican Convention refused to change their votes from Goldwater to Nixon. So the actual vote in the nomination at the end of the first ballot was all the votes for Nixon except for 10 from Louisiana who insisted on going for Goldwater. So I got active at Goldwater's request. I was a student at LSU, and with some other conservative friends. None of us were from Republican families, and none of us was 21 years old and thus not eligible to register. But we created a group called Students for Nixon and Lodge. And at the end of that election, I went to this one friend of my family who was a Yankee who'd come down decades before to work in the oil business and had stubbornly insisted on registering Republican despite arguments from the officials at the courthouse. And I told him, Mr. Simple, I've decided I'm going to register Republican. I'm turning 21 later this month, and I've decided that I want to be a Goldwater delegate to the 1964 convention. And the state convention to elect delegates was 3.5 years away. And he very kindly said to me, Morton, and I'd known him since I was a child, he was a kindly gentleman. And he said, Morton, I'm happy that you're going to register Republican, but there's no way you could be elected a delegate from Louisiana to the 64 convention. And he said, there are only 3 ways you could get to be a delegate. One is you could, and incidentally at the time, party registration in Louisiana was 98% registered Democrat, 1.5% registered Republican, and there was not a single Republican elected in all of Louisiana, not one state legislator, not one local official or anything. He says, but you might be able, people could be elected to delegate if they have given a lot of money to our hopeless candidates, but I know you don't have a lot of money, so that's out. Another way is if people have volunteered to become one of our the hopeless candidates, but you're going to just be 21 and that's too young to be running for office. And the only other way is if you've worked for many, many years for our hopeless candidates, and there aren't many, many years available, so you're not going to be a delegate. And so I said, as I have said from time to time in my life, we'll see. And I got active in Republican youth politics, started a club at LSU, started a young Republican club in Baton Rouge, became college Republican state chairman. We went from 3 tiny college Republican clubs. When I became state chairman 2 years later, we had 15 clubs, and several of them had hundreds of members. And we had been supplying lots of live bodies, volunteers, for campaigns. And when they had the state convention that elected 4 delegates at large to the 1964 convention in San Francisco, the party was not well organized. And it turns out that since I had been spending a lot of time traveling all over the state, organizing college Republican clubs and young Republican clubs and teenage Republican clubs, and I spent the nights on the sofas of the local Republican leaderships or in their guest bedrooms and organized their kids into youth activities. I was known to virtually all of the delegates at the state convention, and most people were Baton Rouge Republicans or New Orleans Republicans or Shreveport Republicans. There were a few who were Louisiana Republicans. So I ran on the slogan, elect one young person, and they elected 4 delegates at large, and there were 3 millionaires and me. And so I was Gary Goldwater's youngest elected delegate in the nation in 1964.
There is a whole series of lessons in that story that are worth keeping in mind, and it really is. Now, you've been to quite a few conventions since then.
I have been to every Republican national convention since then. I'm not always as a delegate, sometimes as an alternate. And in '72, I married a Baton Rouge girl, brought her up to Virginia, and thus could not be a delegate from Louisiana because I wasn't a resident, and couldn't be a delegate from Virginia because I just moved in. But I went to the '72 convention with Paul Weyrich and others, and we fought back the efforts of the Eastern Establishment Republicans. Later they were called rhinos. I prefer to call them content-free Republicans. But we beat back the efforts of Chuck Percy and Jacob Javits and others to change the delegate allocation formula to help the left and hurt conservatives. So I played really an active role in the rules battle as neither a delegate nor an alternate. But since then, I've been delegate or alternate, and since '88, I've been the Republican National Committee man of the Republican Party of Virginia. I'm now in my 9th consecutive 4-year term, and I'm one of the 2 most senior members in terms of tenure of the 168 actual members of the Republican National Committee. There are some who are older than I am, but I've been around longer than all but one guy.
And there's a lesson there too of sticking to politics is one of the keys to making a difference. Now, correct me, the year was about 1980 or 81 that you set up the Leadership Institute.
It was 1979.
79. I'm sorry. Yes.
Leadership Institute. I got in 1965 by a great surprise at the nothing that I had anticipated, but the fellow that we conservatives had chosen as our candidate for national chairman of the college Republicans after our caucus asked me to come to D.C. to be his executive director of the National College Republicans. And it came as a stunning opportunity. I had been a chemical engineering major at LSU and gotten very active in politics. And while I thought about it a lot, I couldn't figure out any way that I could possibly get a job in politics. But this opened up, and I scooted up to D.C., and I was executive director of the National College Republicans off and on for the next 5.5 years under 4 consecutive college Republican national chairman. And while I was there, I did a very active training program and began to conduct national schools in 1968, training people to be full-time youth organizers for candidates. And when I left the college Republicans in November 1970, my successors did not continue my training programs. And I realized that this was truly valuable stuff. In '68, I ran my first school in D.C., trained 20 people who all aspired to be youth organizers. One of them, who organized a youth effort for a Senate candidate in Kentucky named Marlowe Cook. When Cook was elected, he hired his youth coordinator to come to D.C. and serve on his Senate staff. And when Cook was defeated 6 years later, this staffer went back to Kentucky and built his own career, and that fellow's name was Mitch McConnell.
Right.
And I trained a youth coordinator for Arch Moore, Republican from West Virginia, who was running for governor, and he won. And I trained a guy for Ed Gurney. Congressman Gurney was running for the Senate in Florida, and he won. And 2 of those 20 that I trained were youth coordinators for Richard Ogilvie, who was running for governor of Illinois, and he won. And I trained a young businessman in Utah, age 32, who was the youth coordinator for elderly Senator Wallace Bennett of Utah, and who was endangered, and he won. And I asked all of those youth coordinators that I had placed to send me the names of the most outstanding students that they encountered so I could recruit them for future training and send them out. And it just, there was a constant flow of fine people who would come to these training schools and go out and be youth coordinators. And it really did work. And in 1971, when my successors did not continue my school, I said, I can't let all this expertise fade away. And so I created a political action committee and did youth coordinator schools through the 70s through that political action committee, which is now called Conservative Leadership PAC. And
so that's really it's a lesson. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting.
no, well, friends of mine began to tell me through the 70s that I really should start an educational foundation, that you could raise, they said, a lot more money for a 501c3 educational group than you could for a political action committee. You're conducting an education program through your political action committee, and then the political action committee places people in campaigns. But you could educate a lot more people if you headed a foundation. And I had worked in 71 and 72 for the American Enterprise Institute, and was working in what we called then conservative movement activity. And but I knew a lot of foundation presidents, and they all had academic records and wore mustaches and smoked pipes and wore tweed, and I did not fancy myself as the head of an educational foundation. Finally, an old friend of mine who had been a Midwest director for Intercollegiate Studies Institute and has been associated for decades now with Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt, confronted me, and he stuck his finger in my face and he says, "Morton, is there a law that says Morton Blackwell can't be the head of an educational foundation?" I said, "Well, there's no such law." And so I started it, and I was a volunteer always at my PAC, and was a volunteer for years as head of the Leadership Institute. But I began the Institute with just that one youth leadership school, training people to organize mass-based youth efforts for candidates or causes of their choice. And after I left the Reagan White House staff at the end of January of '84, I already had the Institute, which I had founded in '79 and led as a volunteer. And I said, okay, I think I could probably raise enough money to pay a salary to pay my mortgage and feed my family. And I gambled at it. My wonderful wife said, "Go for it, Morton." I left a wonderful job as a special assistant to the President Ronald Reagan, on the White House staff, and there was a good salary and a prestigious position. And then I went out to be what at the time was the sole staffer of the Leadership Institute.
Now, you still give the youth course, but you've also added a lot of additional courses. And I am struck by, in some respects in politics, how much there's a lot that's changed, and the technology has, changed and is always evolving. But a lot of the fundamentals, a lot of the basics are enduring, are really the same, and maybe they're accomplished in a slightly different way. But
the fundamental difference between the Leadership Institute, when I founded it, and every other educational foundation in the conservative movement is that the other groups, the other educational foundations, primarily focused on the very important job of teaching about issues and philosophy and public policy questions. And I thought that what I could do that would contribute the most to political success for conservatives was to find people who were already reasonably conservative and then persuade them that they owe it to their philosophy to study how to win. And a lot of conservatives resist that instinctively. Intellectual conservatives have a tendency to think that to be right in the sense of being correct is sufficient to win, and that to study philosophically neutral skills and techniques of how to organize, how to communicate, how to raise money, those things were mere techniques and beneath their dignity to stoop to studying these non-philosophical techniques. But if you're going to design a piece of printed literature, there are principles which make your literature more effective, and their typefaces and color compositions and layouts and paragraph lengths, some of which work a lot better than others. And if you learn what works and what doesn't work, you can have a greater impact on government and politics and the news media. So that's what I did. And it's today is still what we offer at the Institute. We now offer 47 different types of in-person training. Much of last year we couldn't do in-person training and we had to convert to online training, but now we're reopening everything now that the politicians who greatly enjoy exercising the power to tell everybody in the country what they have to do in great detail, they're losing their grip on this, and things are relaxing. But the teaching folks that they have a moral obligation to study how to win for their conservative principles is the major thing that the Leadership Institute has set out to do, and our training is open admission. I aim to build a movement, not an empire, and many conservative organizations today, some of them very big ones, are headed by people whom I have trained, many of them when they were college students.
I mean, that's actually both the training component, but also the network component are really two aspects to it. I mean, you obviously touched on it by going back to some of the students in '68 that you had. What has been the most popular course, or has it changed over the years, or have you had a couple courses that are sort of enduring?
I still consider the Youth Leadership School the flagship school, because training people how to organize mass numbers of conservative students for candidates or causes of their choice, not only can those people have an impact on the political battles, but they recruit very large numbers of people, conservatives, who would otherwise never get involved in politics. And a really good youth coordinator can involve thousands of students into politics, and many of them stay involved in conservative politics for the rest of their lives. And a lot of people drift away and are never active again, but a lot of people hang around. And in the 1970s, in a very serious way, conservative leaders set about to increase the number and effectiveness of conservative activists. And it was from the early 1970s to 1979, there was an enormous growth in the number of conservative organizations of all types, of educational foundations and political action committees and lobbies and legal defense organizations, a proliferation of them, and there were groups that are, some of them were conservative across the board on all issues, others of them focused on clusters of related issues like family values or the Second Amendment or many other separate segments, and so large numbers of new groups were created, and existing groups suddenly grew in that period. For example, the National Right to Work Committee, which was in 1972 already viewed as one of the most powerful, effective, and prestigious conservative organizations in the country, and they had a justified good reputation. But they had 25,000 members in 1972. By 1979, they had 1.7 million members. And so the plans that those of us who were systematically working to increase the number and effectiveness of conservative activists and leaders bore fruit. And I'm happy to say that there are many new conservative organizations being founded all the time. So many people came to me over the years asking for advice. Young people would say, I think I want to start an organization of such and such type. Morton, tell me what I need to know if I'm going to start an organization. and I would give them across my desk, off the top of my head, advice. And I realized I was giving this advice many times, and I wasn't always covering the same exact materials. I would leave out things and regret that I hadn't said it. So I made a serious set of written notes, got in a bunch of my Leadership Institute interns, and gave them a lecture, which I entitled The Conservative Organizational Entrepreneur. Things that somebody who was starting a new organization or just getting to build one ought to know, and some of the lessons of things to do and things not to do. And then I printed it. I transcribed my lecture and printed it up, and it's still available. If anybody is interested, they could go online, just Google for Conservative Organizational Entrepreneur. And I've updated that little booklet several times, and people still find it useful.
Morton, I'm curious, with all your, experience in politics, and particularly in Virginia, Virginia just went through their unassembled convention, I guess is what they called it.
Yep.
Very, very interesting procedure, to say the least. But I'm going to assume too that the LI, I mean, lots of graduates and people who've gone through LI schools, were heavily involved in this convention. And I'd like to find out, what's your take of the convention and the results? What do you see for the future of the party in Virginia right now?
Well, one of the interesting characteristics of the contest, and there were 7 candidates for the nomination for governor, and I think 6 for lieutenant governor and 4 for attorney general. I think those were the numbers. One of the characteristics was every one of them campaigned as a solid conservative across the board on every issue. And if you were looking for who was going to be the most effective for conservative principles, you had to assess what they were saying now, and you had to go back and learn about what they said before they became candidates for a Republican statewide nomination in Virginia. And there was not a consensus among movement-oriented conservatives as to which candidates to support. But all 3 nominees are maintaining stoutly in their materials that they've said publicly and have been quoted in news media and quoted online. They're all saying that they're deeply committed conservatives on every conceivable issue. We'll see what happens as the campaign progresses. There have been the cases, and I'm not going to call any names, but in many states, and even occasionally in Virginia, there have been people who presented themselves as movement conservatives during the nomination process and then proceeded to run to the middle as soon as they got the nomination. We'll see how things develop among these candidates. But I'm a Republican Party official. I took a very active role in the plans for how the state party was going to nominate. We had a majority who wanted to nominate by convention. We had 5 votes over a period of months where the majority voted to have a convention, but there was a peculiarity that we had to be, in order to have the kind of convention which we had in 2020, we had to amend the state party plan. And to amend the state party plan required a 75% of the vote, and the convention people didn't have 75%, so we were deadlocked literally for months, and long, grueling meetings of the State Central Committee. We had 3 consecutive Saturdays when the Republican State Central Committee of Virginia started meetings at 10 o'clock, and it continued till late in the afternoon on 2 of those Saturdays and ended about 9 o'clock one evening on the other ones. I mean, it was long and drawn out, but finally the majority prevailed, and we had this this unassembled convention. And it went very well in many respects. And one of the interesting aspects of it was that since the nomination was by convention, and even though there were 53,000 people who qualified to be delegates from their cities or counties, there was virtually no public advertising in the primary battle. The campaign communications were directed by phone or mail or email to those 53,000 people, and 30,000 or so of them actually voted in the unassembled convention. But if we had decided to have a nomination by primary, there would have been by this point millions of dollars of Republican contributions spent on paid advertising to the public through public media, where Republican candidates were attacking other Republican candidates and building up the negatives of whoever would be the nominee. And there's been virtually none of that has seeped out among the electorate. And some of the candidates really surprised me by going out of their way in their public speeches to praise their opponents rather than publicly attack them, because the dynamics of this ranked vote system was every candidate knew that in order to win, because nobody was going to have a majority on the first ballot, in order to win, every candidate realized that some of the people who didn't vote for them but voted for other candidates were going to have to vote for them in these multi-ballots. And so, and it wasn't rocket science to figure out that if you're in the running, you're doing very well, and we go through the first round or two of delegates, and candidates who got the smallest number of votes under this system, if the candidates who got the smallest number of votes on each ballot were dropped. And so those people then had their ballots counted with their second choice now was effective. And I think that was a big drag on negativism in this effort. And if you checked it out, virtually every one of those candidates for the nomination for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general has been enthusiastic, saying that we're going to be voting for the full ticket. I think from the interest of the Republican Party as an institution, this nomination process will help. Not only was there not a whole lot of Republican money spent on paid advertising, but there wasn't negative campaigning by one Republican against another in the public media.
Let me press you a little bit. Do you recommend or support ranked choice voting generally, or do you think it was just specific to this particular convention?
I do not support ranked choice voting. I have been a supporter of nominations by convention in almost every case in the almost 50 years that I have been active in the Republican Party of Virginia. The law in Virginia does not allow you to register by party. Everybody registers to vote. And it has been extremely common over the years for people in one party to, on primary day, go and vote in the primary of the opposition party in generally with the view towards having the opposition party nominate a candidate who will be easier for your party to beat. And it's crooked, and it's not good. And so the primary system would, in fact, allow for all this negative campaigning and the damaging of candidates. There is something to be said of a big in-person convention. Twice since I moved to Virginia, we've had conventions where 14,000 delegates showed up at a state convention, and we have a numbers of them with 9,000 or 7,000 people there. And it's a day of activity, and there's socializing which takes place, and people who are Republicans in one part of the state get to know Republicans in other parts of the state, or they get to renew friendships of people that they haven't seen very often. And you can have fundraising events in connection with the convention and raise money to help the party elect its campaigns in the November elections. There are a whole lot of good reasons to nominate by convention, and I guarantee you I'm never going to be in favor of having nominations by primaries, except in the rare case where there's just one serious Republican candidate for a nomination, and for whatever reason that candidate asks the party to determine that the nominations will be done by primary. And I have on occasion voted for primaries there, but otherwise I think it's in the best interest of the Republican Party, and I think it's surely in the best interest of conservative principles to nominate by convention. The reason we had to have this peculiar ranked vote choice was because we could not assemble. The governor would not allow us to assemble, and it was an experiment whether or not it could be done. There were 39 different voting places, and each city or county had a designated location, one of those 39 locations, and people came in and voted, and it was done in an effective and good-spirited way. But
I just thought I'd slip
better, in my opinion.
I just thought I'd try and slip in the guy, an old rules guy like that. I wanted to see where you came out on that. You know, one of the things
I have focused a lot on rules.
Yes.
I've attended every meeting of the National Convention Rules Committee starting in '72. And since 1988, when I became National Committee man, I've been a member of the Convention Rules Committee, except for last year, where we didn't have a Rules Committee and we hardly had a convention because of the pandemic.
One of the challenges over the years, areas of back and forth, has been the role of the National Committee and the state parties, and what the right balance should be, and what the role of the National Committee during the period between conventions. Do you want to elaborate on kind of where that issue comes out in from your point of view?
Well, at the state level, the local party committees in every city and county and the conventional and the congressional district themselves, there are Republican committees which deal with nominating candidates and trying to elect the nominees. And these city and county and congressional district and state legislative district committees are created by and are subject to the authority of the state party. Mm-hmm. But the relationship between the state parties and the National Committee is different. because in fact, the National Committee was created by the state parties, not the reverse. And so in terms of directing the activities of a state party, the Republican National Committee has very little authority to tell state parties what to do. The only authority that the Republican National Committee actually has over state parties has to do with the selection of delegates to the National Convention. Now, as a matter of fact and practice, there's a great deal of power that the National Committee has, because the National Committee has the ability to raise, almost without exception, very large sums of money. And state party committees do not have that ability. And in fact, in many states, elected officials of the party, people who are in elected office in the states, often are not interested in having a lot of resources in the hands of the state parties, because there have often been Republican office holders who pass the word to major donors: don't contribute to the state party, contribute to my political action committee. And in a way, elected officials seem to want to keep party committees barefoot and pregnant. So it's the National Committee can have a big effect on what state parties do if they offer very substantial, big, and repeated contributions to the state party or to the candidates, the nominees of the party. So there's a lot of clout that the RNC has. But if the RNC, and look, there have been national chairmen of the Republican Party, and I have known all of them since Dean Birch was national chairman when Goldwater was running. I've known all the members of the National Committee, some of them very well. Some of those members of the national leaders of the National Committee have not so covertly tried to impact the elections of who's going to be elected state chairman, who's going to be elected national committee man, national committee woman. That is very rare. And when it comes out that a national chairman has tried to influence a state election, it's something of a serious scandal. It has happened, and I'm not going to enumerate the circumstances of it. There's also the problem that sometimes the National Committee and sometimes state party committees fall under the influence of campaign consultants, maybe the consultants who helped the person get elected national chairman or state party chairman. And it is not entirely unknown for a state party or even a national party committee. And now I'm speaking not just about the Republican National Committee, but the National Republican Senatorial Committee, National Republican Congressional Committee. They can have favored consultants. And the candidates know that the National Committee can pour a lot of resources in the campaign. And so the word is passed to the candidate: you have to hire so-and-so as the consultant in your campaign. And that has happened. And in fact, it has happened some cases in Virginia, not recently, but it sure has happened before. And I gave a talk about this baleful influence of consultants in campaigns, where the campaigns are forced to hire the favored consultants of the party committee leadership. And I got from one national chairman, whose name is well known, a telephone call that could have burned to my ear. He was so angry. He told me he was personally offended, and my committee has never done that. And I said, I didn't say it was. I said this was a generic problem. of party committees. But he was furious at me, and I was reminded of one of my father's sayings. What it was that the hen that cackled lays the egg.
Well, that is obviously an interesting story that will continue. We're actually coming up to about 8:15, which is generally we cut these off at about 45 minutes. We certainly could go on. So, Mort, I'm hoping you'll agree to come back on in the future, and perhaps you can summarize all what you've learned. We certainly didn't have a chance to talk about fundraising and donor maintenance and a whole bunch of other topics that I'm sure quite a few people would find interesting. But thank you very much.
A quick summary, if I have to take things that'll be most useful, is telling conservatives you owe it to your philosophy to study how to win. You have a moral obligation to study how to win. If you don't study how to win, and the left studies how to win, and they implement that knowledge, they're going to beat you no matter how right you are.
I can't think of a better final set of words. So thank you very much, Morton Blackwell, and thank you too, Don Irvine. And that's all.